Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the cultivation of physical mediumship. My guest, Robin Foy, I'm honored to be with today, is probably the most prominent proponent of physical mediumship, perhaps in the last century. Robin is the author of In Pursuit of Physical Mediumship. He also is the author of Witnessing the Impossible. Robin was the founder of the Noah's Ark Society, an organization involved in the promotion and cultivation and study of physical mediumship. He is also the founder of the Skoll Group, a mediumistic circle that produced some of the most impressive documented phenomenon related to survival of human consciousness of the last century that has been reported in books and in reports to the Society for Psychical Research. Robin is based in Spain, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Robin. It's a real pleasure to be with you today and to be able to share your wealth of experiences with the new Thinking Aloud audience.
Pleased to be here.
There's so much to talk about. You're launching a new venture right now. Why don't we begin by just telling our viewers a little bit about what you're currently engaged in?
This venture basically is a continuation of the very famous experiment now that we held at Skoll in the 1990s, between 1993 and 1998, when we had a spirit team we were working very closely with, who actually brought about a brand new way of working with physical mediumship. What they did really, instead of using ectoplasm, which was the traditional way of working with physical mediumship, they formed an entirely new way using only a mix of three different types of energy. And these three different types of energy were, the first was actually energy brought by the spirit team themselves when they came to work with us. Secondly was the energy of the sitters. And thirdly, there was the energy that was sort of around and about the earth plane. The three different types, when blended together, formed a creative energy. And it was this creative energy which the spirit team was able to use to produce phenomena. And after we had finished the experiment at Skoll, which unfortunately only lasted 5 years until 1998, the spirit team actually dictated to us during that time a short sort of not pamphlet, it's a 72-page booklet actually, which tells anyone else who wants to develop physical mediumship exactly how to go about it, and exactly what they need and what they're likely to expect. And this booklet now, we had several hundred copies printed in the beginning. They've all gone, and it's only available to download actually from the internet now. But several hundred people have used this over the years and had really, really successful results. So, we have done extremely well with the spirit team working with energy. Having said that, when Skoll finished, we were moved by spirit to come to Spain, and we didn't really understand entirely why we were wanted over here at that time. But we came over here to Spain in 2006, and we've been living in a very, very small apartment here on the Costa Blanca. But in 2007, we actually had a couple of physical mediums who were working with energy too, came to stay with us. They were from Glasgow in Scotland, and they were getting very good phenomena. And whilst they were over here, we had 3 sittings with them. And during those 3 sittings, all of our spirit team, including the ET that we'd been in contact with during the skull experiment, all materialized in the room quite solidly, so we were able to interact with them. And they told us that we would be starting a center in Spain. They wouldn't give us, this is in 2007, they wouldn't give us the actual location of where this was going to be, except they did give us 25 clues. We were told that the name of the town started with an A, and there was a mountain very close by that was a sacred mountain, and which had a portal between the spirit world and the earth. And that was one of the reasons they wanted us over here to work in its close vicinity. There were also there were also burial mounds which are in this place, and that they were 6,000 years old. So these 25 clues, I researched them, and it pointed to only one place in the whole of Spain. It couldn't be anywhere else. Oh, there'd also been UFO sightings there. And this had to be a place called Antequera in Spain, which is in Andalusia, and which is approximately 260 miles south of us here, where we are on the Costa Blanca. So, of course, the interesting thing here was that we thought we'll go and have a look at this place, which we did in July in 2007. We drove down. It was a long journey, say 240, 50 miles. And we arrived, I don't know, sort of 12-ish midday, getting a bit hungry because we hadn't had any breakfast. So we thought, first of all, we'd go and look for this sacred mountain. And on the road between Antequera and the sacred mountain, which is only about 5 miles away from Antequera, we spotted a restaurant. We thought we'll stop here and have some lunch. At this point, I should say that a few months previously, we'd actually driven all the way back to the UK. And whilst there, Sandra had a sitting with a medium who was a mental medium, clairaudient, clairvoyant. And her mother had come through at that meeting and said that you are going to go to a centre in Spain. You're going to start it. And whilst you're in Antequera, you must watch out for goats with bells on. So we didn't really think too much about that at the time. But when we arrived in Antequera and we stopped at this restaurant, it looked as though it was closed, and we were just about to drive away when a little old chap, looked in his 90s, sort of looked out from one of the windows and said, "No, come on in, I'll cook you a meal." And that's exactly what we did. We went in, we had a lovely meal there. I was sitting with my back to one of the windows. Sandra was sitting facing the window. And all of a sudden she said to me, "Oh my God." And I spun round, and there, coming down the hill, just outside the restaurant, were hundreds of goats with bells on round their necks. So this obviously was exactly what her mother had told her in spirit, and so it was evidential for us. What we didn't realise at that time, and only realised for the first time about 5 years ago, was the fact that this restaurant was actually the premises in which they wanted us to start the centre. But we went on from there and we looked at the Torcal, and there's no doubt about it. We do think it's a very, very sacred mountain, and I'm sure that there probably is a portal in there, which is something that will come into our work at a later stage. So that's what we did at that time. And when we drove back to the hotel, because we booked into the hotel before we left to go and look at the mountain, we had taken with us all of the crystals which we laid out in a particular pattern during our sittings on the table in our seance room, and we left them in a plastic bag sitting on a table in the bedroom in the hotel we'd booked into. And when we came back from the meal and looking at the mountain, the crystals had been taken out of the bag and they had been set on this table exactly in the pattern in which we set them when we sat at Skull. So again, that was quite evidential for us, and obviously there was physical phenomena going on for that to happen. So that went on, and over the years, we went backwards and forwards to Antequera, looking for a property we thought would be suitable for this centre. And in the meantime, we'd been back to the UK several times, and we had friends in France that were living in France. And he was also developing physical mediumship at that time and was a good mental medium. And we told him that we were looking for this centre in Antequera. And the passing remark he gave us when we left him in the morning was, "You will know when you found the right place when you see eagles flying over it." So, okay, fair enough. And about 5 years ago, we were down in Antequera, and we just happened to be passing this restaurant that I've told you about. And there was a banner across the front of it offering it for sale. So we thought, well, this might well be interesting. And we drove up to the restaurant. Just as we were getting out of the car, we looked up, and there ahead of us were 2 golden eagles flying overhead. So we thought, well, okay, that's it. This is going to be the place eventually. And we looked at the price, and we didn't have the money to pay for the place at that time. So we left it for a couple of years on and off, and we'd been having sittings in Spain from time to time. Sometimes we got phenomena, sometimes we didn't. But about 4 years ago now, I had a telephone reading with a medium called Sandy Ingham. She is a fantastic psychic artist. She works in the States as well as in the UK and various other countries. And I didn't know to begin with that she was an artist, but I'd been sent a book which was really all about the whole of mediumship. And in this book, the woman that wrote it had sittings with 2 mental mediums who she recommended. And one of those mediums was Sandy Ingham. And during my reading with Sandy Ingham, her guides came through, told us everything about our own guides, got them absolutely accurate and evidential. And she'd never met me or heard of me before. And we were told at that time, get on with it. You've got to start a foundation or an organisation of some type and raise the funds to buy this property. Well, that's exactly what we did. And over the 5-year period, or 4-year period, we'd been trying to raise enough money. The selling price was round about 225,000. It had started out at about 400,000 and gone down from that price to about 225,000. But all we could raise basically was 37,000 euros. So we didn't have anything like enough to actually buy the property. But it was suggested to us by another medium that we approach the owners to see if they would do a deal with us where we could do a rent to buy option and put down a 10% deposit on the price of the property and then rent it over a period of 2 or 3 years, in which time we could make the effort to we'd run the centre, but we'd also fundraise to try and get the money together to buy this property permanently. Well, we used a little organisation who were interpreters and had all a legal branch and everything, and they acted as go-betweens for us. And they discovered that a year ago, this property had actually been bought. It had laid dormant for 4 years, and then it had been bought by a chap who wanted to turn it into a bed and breakfast, sort of a accommodation thing with a restaurant downstairs. Now, he had spent a lot of money on it, a lot of time on it doing this, but then COVID came along. He owns another restaurant which is very popular in the area, and he's been very successful with it. But his restaurant had been totally closed down by the Spanish government because of this COVID business. So he had a cash flow problem, and he jumped at the idea of us having a buy to rent option on this over a 2-year period, and a figure of 300,000 was agreed as the price of this property. Well, we learnt that he had paid only 190,000, but he'd spent a lot of money on it himself. And the bank were now valuing this property at 365,000. So we thought 300,000 is not an unreasonable price. And on that, we have to put down a 10% deposit. So we had raised about 37,000 euros, of which we were going to have to spend 30,000 on this, 2 or 3,000 on the organisation who was setting it up for us, and some legal fees. So we had actually raised just enough, and this very often happens when spirit wants something to take place, to actually have this deal and work this deal, so that we could work on a 2-year rent to buy option. And that's basically where we are at the moment. We're thinking in terms of actually starting this agreement in July. So we're intending to move lock, stock and barrel from where we are down to Antequera to actually live in this property. And nearby to us, in the meantime, in the organisation that we've started, which will be known as the Spiritual Science Founders Association. Spiritual science was mentioned by our spirit team way back in the 90s, and they told us that it's a pure science, very much the same as physics, chemistry and biology, but it's a pure science that's dedicated to life and the afterlife. So this is a science that can be studied, of course, and in a scientific research way, that's exactly what we want to do. But we also want to be able to demonstrate to the public exactly what physical mediumship is, and to allow members of our organisation to share that with us by sitting with us and experiencing this phenomenon for themselves. And that's what we're hoping to do. So we are trying to get as many members as we can for this organisation. And the cost to join is only 20 euros a year. So it's very small amount. But in so doing, it will bring some funds in for us. And we are still getting a few donations coming through there. But we think that we can make a go of it. But during the time that we've had this organisation going, we met a German couple about 3 years ago. Now, the German couple are very much going to be involved with us in running this organisation. They are living at the moment near, not Frankfurt, near Cologne in Germany. And they will be moving also, not into the centre, but close to the centre, about 25 minutes away by car. But he, Uwe Siegert, is a very, very good physical medium, working with energy, the same as we did at Skoll. And they're getting excellent phenomena. So he will be involved in the work that we're doing there, in the experiments we're doing, and in the demonstrations that we want to give to our members mainly, but also eventually to the public.
Well, it's a great adventure you're about to embark on. We're now speaking at the latter part of April, but so within 90 days, you'll actually be living on those premises.
That's it indeed, yes.
Let me also say, for individuals who are watching the video right now and are interested in supporting your work, that they can use PayPal to send a $20 or €20 membership fee to your email address, and we will post your email address to which that fee can be sent in the description of this video. And now, Robin, let me ask you, let's go back to the beginning of your exploration. I think you started your first encounters with physical mediumship back around 1973, which coincidentally is the year that I entered my own doctoral study program in parapsychology at the University of California. So in our own way, you and I are part of the same generation, and we both have about a half a century of inquiry behind us. So I'm very interested in your whole story.
Going back to the beginning of it, there's an awful lot in between, so you may find that you need to put out a few more videos. But I was sort of coming up to 30 years old, and it's nearly 48 years ago now. And throughout my childhood, I had certainly been interested in ghost stories and anything of that type. In fact, my parents had bought me books on sort of hauntings and ghosts and so forth. And we used to have a sort of joke in the family when we went past some of these old houses that are sort of semi-derelict, saying, oh, well, that must be haunted and things. My mother was actually naturally psychic. She could have developed a very, very good clairvoyant mediumship. But really, we used to just sort of say, oh, that's one of Mum's sort of one of her special sort of ideas. But they turned out to be very evidential. During this particular year, in 1973, I was actually looking through a local paper. I was living at that time in the UK, and I was living close to a big city called Leicester. And there was a Leicester newspaper that came out on a weekly basis. And in that paper, there was an advert for anybody that was interested in psychic research. It didn't really say much about it, other than the fact that there was a box number to write to. And somehow I was looking at this advert, and it appeared to me to actually be in bold type, although it wasn't in fact in bold type. And I felt that I had to respond to it. So I wrote to this character, and it turned out to be a chap who was actually called Elmer Brown. I think he'd had American parents, and he had a shop in the Leicester area. But he'd been running circles for some time, and the circles, I should explain really, a circle is basically a number of people sitting together to try and develop physical phenomena. Now, he'd been sitting for many years, and he'd made a lot of contacts and a lot of friends within the organisation of spiritualism and so forth and so on. And I should say at this point that I'm not a spiritualist. I look upon myself as a spiritual scientist. So I'm looking upon it from the study point of view, and not from a religious point of view in any way, shape or form. Although I have, over the years, had a lot of experience of spiritualist churches that I've visited, and spiritualist mediums that I've visited to verify, sort of how mediumship works. But I went along to this chap. I was invited to go to an interview about his circle, and I think he had a circle that sat once a week, and I think he'd had about 15 sitters in this circle, and lost about 8 or 9 of them over the years. And he was trying to sort of build up the circle to 12 or 13 again. When I attended the interview there in Leicester with him, the house he was living in was quite some distance from the main road, about 200 yards, I would say, from the main road. And behind it was a field, so there was nothing behind it. And when I visited him, it was dark. So there wasn't likely to be anybody walking around in the field. On either side of his house was a gap of another 200 yards to the next house. So he was very much a detached house, away from the road, away from anything behind him. And he was talking to us about this circle, what it was all for, and what physical mediumship was. And we listened to that. And about 2 of the people there decided that they weren't really interested anyway, and they went home. And in the meantime, this chap, Elmer Brown, said to us, would you like to see the room in which we sit? So the 3 of us or so that were left behind said, yes, that'd be great. And we walked sort of crocodile style up his stairs, because the room they sat in was an annex over the top of his garage, but you had to go through his bedroom to get to it. And as we were going up the stairs, every one of us heard quite distinctly a baby crying in midair. And we all looked at one another and sort of said to the chap, whose house it was, well, oh, you've got a nephew in, or a child, or what have you. He said, no, there's no children here, and there's no houses close by that have children. And I sort of said, well, this is what we'd heard. And he said, well, maybe Spirit's trying to tell you something. So anyway, we went and had a look at this room that they sat in, and it was pretty bare. There were just chairs around the room, actually, with their backs literally sitting against the wall. So nobody could have got behind any of these chairs anyway. And in one corner was a very old-fashioned radiogram to play records. And that was about it. So we came downstairs and sort of went home, and I told them that I was interested in joining the circle, which I subsequently did. And I sat with that circle every week for about a year and a half. After I got home, within the next 2 days, my first wife and I had applied to adopt a child. We had a telephone call from the adoption agencies to say, we've got a baby for you, come and collect him. So it couldn't have been much more evidential than that. Exactly what Spirit was saying, sort of your first child's coming along. In that circle, the first time I sat in that circle, I had we were sitting in the dark, but people had wristbands on with luminous wristbands, so you could see if they moved around. I was poked in the back by a materialized finger. That's the very first time that I was there. And as we were singing during some of the songs, we could hear this little whispered voice between me, my right ear, and the lady on my right, her left ear, and we could both hear this little whispered voice singing along with us. And in that circle, we had a little bit of phenomena, and we gradually sort of developed a bit here and a bit there. But this chap knew a very, very famous physical medium called Leslie Flint, who lived in London. Leslie Flint was a direct voice medium. So in other words, in Leslie Flint's seances, he would sit there and spirits would speak from midair, and you'd be able to have a conversation with the spirits. And sometimes even Leslie Flint himself would join in. So you could tell it's not Leslie trying to speak when the voices were coming through. And it must have been about 2 months after I joined the circle, we went down. Elmer sort of took us down to London for a sitting with Leslie Flint, and he was doing this on a regular basis. And during that sitting with Leslie Flint, I think we had about 15 spirit people spoke to us over a period of 3 hours. At anything up to 15 minutes at a time, we could carry on conversations with them. And they were speaking in their own voices when they'd been alive. And there was a few famous people, but also people that no one had ever heard of. But we had some interesting conversations there. And over the following years, I got to know Leslie Flint extremely well. And I took my own groups to visit Leslie Flint. We always got extremely good phenomena. Leslie died in 1994, and we went to his funeral. But that's how it all started. And then when I'd been in that circle for about 18 months, I became redundant from my job, which was a sales manager at that time for a paper making company. I had to sort of look around for a new job. And the only job that I could get at that time was actually down in Kent with Bowwater's paper making organisation. And I went to them as a representative. So I actually moved to London. I was living in a bed sitting in London at that time, and during the week, sort of living in a little commercial hotel there. So whilst I was in London for a period of a year or so, I was going to all sorts of different spiritualist churches. I decided that I wanted to really research mediumship altogether. And I went to so many different spiritualist churches, sort of sitting at the back and just listening to the mediums. And discovering that some mediums were good and some mediums were bad, and some mediums shouldn't even have been there. And it was one of those things where you because of the fact that I was looking at an awful lot of different cases, and also whilst I was there, I took the opportunity to have private sittings with about 200 different spiritualist mediums. So I got an awful lot of information about myself and about the circles that I should be starting and running. And so I was really learning all the time that I was there at that time. And whilst I was in London, I put out an advert in a newspaper which was called the Psychic News, asking for anybody that was interested in starting a circle to get in touch. And there were several replies, and I sort of went to see most of them. But the one that I found was really impressed me was a chap called John Squires, who lived in Romford in Essex, not too far out of London. But eventually I started a circle in Romford with this chap and his landlady, and a couple of other people joined us over the years, a couple of years that we were running the circle. He was a most fantastic deep trance medium, and he used to bring through all sorts of characters in deep trance. And we were sitting also for physical, but the phenomena, there was not very much phenomena at the time I was sitting there. It was mainly just deep trance. And I got to know him very well. And for one reason or another, I moved on from that circle and started another circle elsewhere with a medium who was sitting, who was actually a professional medium giving sittings for the public. In the meantime, I'd split up my wife and I sort of split up, and a divorce was sort of looming there. But I was on one occasion, I was just passing through. I'd left that circle at Romford. I was just passing through Romford, and I decided just to pop in one afternoon as I was passing through. And when I sort of got there, he was actually in the process of interviewing 2 or 3 new people to sit in his own circle. And one of the people who was there was a girl called Sandra. She's just going for her interview, and she actually turned out to be eventually the one I married, and Sandra and I have been married 42 years now. But we ourselves have sort of really become very much a team involved in psychic research and in starting particular organizations to really get things going. While we were in London, we did get married, and we bought a house in a place called Harold Wood, which is on the outskirts of London. And we had a room there that was constantly blacked out, and we used as our circle room. And we had a circle once a week in there. And again, we had different sitters sort of came and went and so forth. And it was in that circle we started to get some phenomena that would happen in that circle. Levitation. We used to have water sprinkled onto us. There were sort of few psychic lights and bits and pieces, not all that fantastic, but it was gradually sort of developing. But what did develop there was teleportation, and it was something we'd never heard of within any psychic organizations or within spiritualism. And this was teleportation of live animals. To begin with, after one of our circle sittings in Harold Wood, we came downstairs afterwards and went through to the kitchen to make a cup of tea for the sitters, a slice of cake, etc. And on one of the kitchen surfaces was a cage in which we had one of the daughters had got her school hamster in there. And this cage was still locked, but the hamster was missing. And we sort of looked high and low. We had everybody from the circle on their knees looking for this blinking hamster in the lounge and couldn't find it. And in the end, Sandra went back into the kitchen and said to Spirit aloud, "Look, Spirit, if you've got this hamster, bring him back." And as she stood there and looked at the surface, the kitchen surface, a bright light appeared on the kitchen surface that was very much vibrating and vibrating very fast. And as the vibration slowed down, the form of the hamster appeared and got gradually sort of more and more solid until he was just back to normal again. And that was the first one of the teleportation experiments we'd seen. They hadn't harmed the animal at all. He was totally okay. Just put him back in the cage. But that happened 2 or 3 more times during our sittings at Harold Wood. And we also had there the same thing happen to our dog. We had a large sort of black collie cross there called Ben. And whenever we came down from the sittings, we put him outside and locked the door whilst we had tea, etc. But on this one occasion, he'd been put outside and the door had been locked to the kitchen. And one of the girls from the circle was bringing our glasses of water down from the sitting. And we suddenly heard a scream from the kitchen. And what had happened was that the dog had really rematerialized with his wet nose on her leg. So she screamed. And that was exactly what spirit were doing experiments in teleportation. And that became more and more important as we got into our later experimental era. But interestingly, at one of the sittings we had during the Romford Circle, and I went back to that, I was asked to go back to that circle actually by Sandra shortly after she joined the circle. And we actually developed independent voice through that medium. Plus we had an awful lot of phenomena, levitations, solid people standing there and things who we were able to interact with. And at one of those sittings, in an independent voice speaking from midair, there was a scientist called Dr. Dunn, and he spoke to us and he said to us on that occasion, in the future, you will be able to get phenomena with just energy and not ectoplasm. And it was something that sat with us, but of course it never really occurred to us that this was going to be something that we were involved in at that stage. But when Skull came about many years later, then this chap came back, Dr. Dunn, and said, I told you so. But that was a different thing altogether. So that was how far we'd sort of got at that stage.
One of the things that you wrote about that I found very interesting is that early on in your career, I think maybe even in the seances with Elmer Brown, you met Alan Gauld, who later became the president of the Society for Psychical Research, and in the Skoll report wrote a wonderful testimonial to you, said he had known you for 30 years and never during that time did he have any reason to doubt your integrity.
Absolutely, indeed. I mean, Alan was a regular sitter. He used to attend the circle whenever his wife allowed him to. So he was there a lot. Yeah.
There's so much to talk about. I know you attended many, many groups and you worked with Leslie Flint for a period of some 30 years, attending his many direct voice seances. Let's talk about the beginning of the Skoll. Well, no, wait. Let me back up. Let's talk about the Noah's Ark Society.
Yeah, that was one of the things that happened along the way. We got involved when we were living in Harold Wood. We started to do our own little demonstrations in a local scout hut with mediums we knew were good, genuine mediums. And we met a medium in Romford in Essex called Eileen Roberts, who was very, very well known as a medium round there. And she ran an organisation called the ISM, which was the Institute of Spiritualist Mediums. I was asked to become the chairman of the Romford branch, which I did. I was sort of doing a lot of work with Eileen Roberts into physical mediumship. And whilst I was working with her, she had the idea, and also Sandra and I had the idea, of bringing back an organisation that had started in the 1920s called the Home Circle Link, or Link of Home Circles. And this had been started by a chap called Noah Zerdin. We actually sort of got in touch. We started this within the ISM, and we got in touch with circles all over the world who were just ordinary circles doing clairvoyance, clairaudience, but some of them were physical circles. So we had circles all over the world we were in touch with, including circles in Israel and in the USA and in the UK, of course, and Australia and various other places. But we did actually, funnily enough, we did visit a couple of the member circles in Israel at one time. But the main thing was that we learnt an awful lot about physical mediumship, because some of the circles that belonged to that had mediums who were good physical mediums, materialization mediums, etc. So we did a lot of work on that, and we worked with Eileen Roberts for about 2 or 3 years running that, and then she took over as we got more and more into our own work, and which at that time was the Noah's Ark Society. But we had to move away from London, and we decided that we were going to rent a property sort of somewhere that was a little bit away from London. And I had the idea that it would be great to actually rent a property that had been a vicarage or a rectory, thinking that maybe spiritual work had been done there. So I spent an awful long time going around all the churches and all the organisations within the Church of England to see if they had any rectories that they were prepared to rent to us. I'd almost given up. I'd been around about 8 or 9 different areas, and I thought, well, I'll just try Norwich, and I went to see the Church of England people in Norwich, and they said, well, actually, yes, we have got a rectory we can rent to you for 2 years. Are you interested? So we sort of said yes, and it was a very reasonable price. And they sort of said, well, you can either rent it or buy it after that time. And so we moved into this rectory, which was absolutely beautiful. The C of E vicars and rectors lived very, very well, and they had all the best type of furniture and stuff in there. But whilst there, of course, we wanted to continue with a circle. But we didn't really have any sitters ourselves at that time. So I looked in the adverts in the Psychic News, and I found an advert for a circle that was sitting in Ilkeston in Derbyshire, about 120 miles away, that was sitting for physical. And I went to sit in that circle on a regular basis once a month. And he was starting to get direct voice himself in that circle. And at one of the sittings, in Ilkeston in Derbyshire, Spirit came through in the independent voice, and it was actually Noah Zerdin that was speaking to us. And he asked us to start an organisation, and this was in 1990. He asked us to start an organisation to save physical mediumship, because he said a lot of the physical mediums that have been there in the past are now coming back to Spirit and dying off. They're elderly. Nobody seems to be developing it, so we need somebody to get an organisation going to bring physical mediumship back to the world, so that it doesn't literally die a death. And I immediately started with that circle, and we set up an organisation called the Noah's Ark Society. I was the chairman of that for many years, and of course, I actually financed it in the beginning. But gradually we were getting in touch with physical mediums and circles sitting for physical all over the world again. and we actually found amongst our own ranks and members 2 mediums, one of whom lived in Hull, Stuart Alexander. But he lived in Hull, and he was a very, very good physical medium. And after we'd been together in that organisation for a year, he admitted that he was a physical medium, and he volunteered giving demonstrations of physical mediumship to members of the Noah's Ark Society. The reason we called it the Noah's Ark Society was that, first of all, it was Noah's Erdin that we got the message from. And the Ark of the Covenant, if you like, was something to sort of save spirituality in its day, and had a lot of spiritual secrets in it. We were aiming to save physical mediumship. So that was what that was all about. And also, during the course of the Noah's Ark Society, I also discovered a circle sitting down right on the south coast of the UK. Again, it was about a 120-mile journey for me, and sitting weekly, and I started to sit in that circle. And out of that circle came a physical medium called Colin Fry, who at the time we didn't really want his full name to be known, because at that time, anybody that became a physical medium had people rapping at their door every day, and sort of right through the year trying to get a sitting. But we called him Lincoln, which was sort of an anagram of Colin, really. He had very, very good phenomena. But the very first overnight seminar that we held was in Leicester, and that was in 1991. And Colin Fry at that time demonstrated for us. There were 100 delegates, and we had a sitting in the hotel there for 100 people, and the most fantastic physical mediumship phenomena occurred whilst we were there, and that brought when that went into the psychic news, brought a lot more members along. So the Noah's Ark Society became sort of very well known, and Sandra and I left the Noah's Ark Society eventually in 1994, because at that time we'd started the Skull experiment, and we were asked by our spirit team to walk away from the Noah's Ark Society, which had already done its job. It had saved physical mediumship. Interest in physical mediumship all over the world had rocketed. And so really we'd done exactly what Spirit wanted us to do. And then they wanted us to get on with something different, which was the Skull experiment.
Now, the Skull experiment has become quite famous. Some people regard it as the most significant physical evidence of mediumship in support of the idea of postmortem survival that we've seen in the last 100 years. So let's talk about how that came about.
Well, it was purely and simply the fact that we were living at this rectory in a place called Postwick, or Poswick as the locals called it, just outside Norwich in the UK. And after 2 years in the rectory, the Church of England came back to us and said, right, do you want to buy the rectory? Well, we didn't, because there was a big crack in the back wall of the rectory, and we didn't fancy spending thousands of pounds on sorting that out. So we thought, well, we need to rent another property, but one that's big enough for our sittings. And whilst we were there, Sandra got the local paper, which was the East Anglian Times, I think, or similar. And it covered the whole of East Anglia. And in there was an advert, pretty much similar to the one that I'd seen in Leicester years previously, that stood out to her as though it was in bold type when it wasn't. And it offered a farmhouse to rent. It didn't actually say what the rent was. It didn't say where the property was. It just said a farmhouse. So they had in the advert that you had to apply to an estate office to get an interview with the chap that owned it all. I immediately went and got a form to sort of put into this chat, because I felt that Sandra had seen this. She felt it was right. And she's actually more psychic than I am. So we applied to rent this property. We didn't know where it was. The interesting thing is that when we had been in London, we had been doing some genealogy on our roots. And Sandra's family came from Norfolk. Her father and that family came from Norfolk. So very frequently we would sort of spend a weekend looking at graves in churchyards and things, and trying to, sort of suss out who was in Sandra's family. And when we did that, we would often stay at a hotel called the Skull Inn, which was in a little village called Skull. It's right on the borders of Norfolk and Suffolk. It actually sat in Norfolk, but at the bottom of the village, you went across a river, and that was Suffolk. So we knew Skull itself. And on one occasion, we were in it was actually a four-poster bedroom, overlooking at the side an old farmhouse. And Sandra on one occasion looked out of the window, and this is way before we applied for this one, looked out of the window and said to me, "Gosh, that's a nice house there. I suppose it must belong to the manager of this inn. But I'd like something like that." You can imagine when we eventually we had to meet the owner of this estate, and he owns about 100 houses. And it's a fellow called Sir Rupert Mann. We met him, and he interviewed us, and he sort of said, "Well, I'll let you know if you're suitable, sort of thing." He said, "I've just interviewed someone else." But we had been sitting outside for an hour or so before our time for the interview, and nobody had come out. So we thought, well, that was just his ploy to sort of see if he thought we were undesirables to kick us out. But anyway, he decided that we were okay to rent his property. And it turned out that he allowed his secretary to drive us to a property which was going to be the one. And we just could not believe our eyes, because when we drove into the drive of this farmhouse, it was the exact house that Sandra had looked out of the Skull Inn at and said, I love that house. And she had years previously, even before she knew me, she'd had sittings with local mediums, and she'd been told that she would live in a property, and that there were trees around, a very, very ancient tree, they said, and that it was all connected with S's, sort of anyway, it turned out to be evidential, because it was Skull, it was street farmhouse. It was the sign for the Skull Inn virtually literally hung over our house. And she had dreams in which she'd seen this room with fireplaces with motifs written across the fireplace. And anyway, we went to see this property, and the property had been built in about 1600, and it had two cellars, it was absolutely perfect. But there were two fireplaces, one in the lounge, said "Welcome Ever Smiles" over the fireplace, and it was all sort of encrypted into the wood of the fireplace. And in the end room, which was our library to begin with, it said "After work rest and after rest work," a similar sort of thing. But we could see it was in a bad state, and we had to do it up ourselves. That's part of the deal, but we got a fairly low rental for that. So that's how we got to Skull. And we used to call this chap, Sir Rupert Mann, Mr. 10%, because every year he came along for a rent review, and every year he put the rent up by 10%. But the long and the short of it, we absolutely loved it in this place, and we started sitting, and we brought in one or two people who had sat with us in the rectory finally, because we'd used the study in the rectory to sit in previously. And so that's how the skull group started. And in the Noah's Ark Society, two of the members had volunteered their services to renovate one of the cellars, so that we could use it for sitting in, because it's in an awful state when we first got to this farmhouse. So they did that, and the first few sittings we had were in the library, and then when it was finished, we moved down to the cellar, which we call the skull hole.
I understand from your book about all of this that Stuart Alexander came and actually did one of the very first seances there.
Yes, he did indeed. Yeah. You know, we were told that it would be dedicated by spirit, and his spirit came and dedicated it. Yeah.
And then at that time, a lot of phenomena began. Something about the chemistry of the four of you and Sandra, and the two other mediums who worked with you seemed to produce an extraordinary amount of phenomena.
Well, they did actually, but I think it'll take quite a long time to go into that. And I think we should maybe leave that for another situation. But because to begin with, we did use that cellar for demonstrating physical phenomena to members of the Noah's Ark Society. And that really carried on until 1994. But in 1993, we started to get results with the skull experiment, and that was our own group. So that really has to be separated from what was going on with the demonstrations by Colin Fry and by Stuart Alexander down in the coal hole, or the skull hole as we used to call it. But I think perhaps, you know, if it's all right with you, we could carry on another session to cover exactly what happened with skull.
Well, I would be delighted to do that. I think that you have such a wealth of experience. We've just covered several decades of it worth in the last hour, so I know we're just scratching the surface, but your story is so important. I want to make sure that we cover it in as much detail as we can do, Robin. So I'm delighted that you're willing to continue with me, and hopefully we'll have many more conversations.
Yeah, I certainly hope we will, Joe.
Well, for now, Robin, thank you so much for being with me. This has been a wonderful pleasure and a joy, and it's been enlightening as well.
Jolly good. Okay, well, we can carry on next time.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.